Welcome to part 4 of dual gauge turnout. Today we're going to start to make the frogs. The frog is the region where two rails cross over each other. Now the fast tracks system has you create a point of two converging rails, and then you solder those together and you make them of a known diverging angle or frog number. And then you have your point rails and wing rail, this portion right here on the template right here, made out of one piece. The purpose of the wing rail is to guide the flange through the frog point out the other side. And you can see here that this rail was also meant to be made with a wing rail on the side. I have so many little pieces in this dual gauge that would have to be a point rail, wing rail, point rail, ring rail, point rail, or here's a point, here's a wing rail, another point. I thought instead of trying to fabricate 18 little pieces, it would be easier for me to cut the rail in place. So what I'm going to do is on this common rail diverging route point rail, I'm going to cut the top half of this rail out where it would interfere with the narrow gauge through route point rail. So right here, this frog, I'm going to take the top half of the common rail diverging route and the bottom half of the narrow gauge, and we're going to slide them in together like a keyed joint. So what I've done now is I have set my caliper, my gauge, my dial caliper, to the 0.65 gauge of the HON3. I'm going to go ahead and get a straight edge. Place it on the rail at the HO gauge. Hold it in place there. There. Check the gauge out here, a little out. A little more out. There. There. I'm now going to use my triangle file. I'll put the perpendicular edge next to my straight edge and just scribe the top of the diverging route common rail point rail, and I can see a mark. So I'm going to continue that file path with my triangle file. I'm going to check my gauge again. I like it. The triangle file has just scribed the inside of the gauge. So now I'm going to take my flat file and run it in that groove that the triangle file made. This flat file has teeth on one narrow edge and it's bald or smooth on the other edge. And the purpose of that is to let you either bite downward into your cut with the file or not, and then you can just address the edges. I'm satisfied now that I have the correct path through the top of that rail head. I'm going to begin to saw with something with a little more aggressive a bite, and that is just a little bit of hacksaw here. I can see now that I am fully through the rail head and about halfway through the rail base or rail web. I want to leave the base intact. It's what's going to help me retain the correct curvature through this area. Now what I want to do is I want to find out what portion of the narrow gauge rail I need to remove the base from. So I'm going to try and bring the rail back across its original route. Going up and over the rail that we've just notched. Bringing it out to its point stop position on the template. And now I'm going to put some marks on the rail. I'll do this on the rail head, but ever so faintly. So as I look down at the rail, I can see that the point of interference between the base of the diverging route and the base of the through route is right here. And the interference point between the diverging route and the narrow gauge through route is right here. So those are the 2 points that we're going to have to remove material from. Okay, back to the narrow gauge rail. I need to remove the web of the rail, and here are my 2 marks for the clearance that I have to achieve. So I'm going to notch the rail base at the proximal end of each cut. I'll drop it into my rail holding groove in the template board. Just a little more distance. Okay, I'm going to transfer those marks fully across the base of the rail. I'm now going to get my flat file, this file. Yeah, much better. So now I want to just remove the base of the rail and about half of the web. Okay, with the notch cut out of the narrow gauge through route point rail. You can see I removed the base and about half of the web. Off camera, I've taken out the spikes for that narrow gauge through route point rail. On my side, I've taken them out so that I can slide the rail in easily. So I'll go ahead and lay that in. Right now I'm checking for the depth of the cut. And the rail base on either side of the cut is not quite touching the template board. So I've got to remove a little more material. I think what I'm going to do is take a little bit of that material off of the diverging route common rail. And part of the reason is I don't want to mess too much more with the narrow gauge through route, because the rail head is the only thing that's left intact at this point, and that's not the strongest element. The rail base is stronger. So now with the rails pressed down to the template board, I can see that the clearance is, gosh, it's perhaps just another thousandths high. We'll go ahead and take a little bit more out of the web of the common rail diverging route point rail. What I'm doing is I'm trying to pick a needle file that has the same thickness as the rail head. I don't want to make it too wide because then I'll lose some of the precision of the frog. As I position it, press both rails down to the baseboard of the template. That is a very good fit. So I'm going to go ahead and set this piece aside. This diverging route, or excuse me, through route, narrow gauge, point rail is only involved in one frog. So we are done there. I'm going to set that one aside. The next piece I want to work on is probably the narrow gauge diverging route stock rail, because it only has one frog on it. So we're going to put the narrow gauge diverging route point rail back into its spikes. And we're going to repeat the process that we just did with the narrow gauge through route. Now what we're going to do is we're going to cut the frog for the standard gauge through route point rail. I have to set my dial caliper back to my 1-inch gauge for my ON48. So now I'm going to put my straight edge in gauge at the frog position. I'm going to use my triangle file to scribe the top of the railhead. At this point, the frog is very shallow angle, and it's almost as though I'm trying to cut along the length of the rail head itself. So the tendency is to slide off the rail head away from the registered mark that I want. So this takes a little bit of effort. Off camera, I have taken the top railhead off of the common route, diverging route point rail, and the narrow gauge diverging route stock rail. I've created a notch by taking the railhead and about half of the web off. Also off camera, I have prepared the point rail for the through route standard gauge by removing the rail base and about half of the web. So now with some luck, I should be able to drop this rail into place and have a pretty good fit. I'm going to pull this spike on the near side to me, and I'm going to slide the rail in up against the rail joiners near you. I'll position the point rail where it needs to go, up in the point notch, right about there, and secure it. Now let's take some judgments of depth. So I'm pressing the new standard gauge point rail through route all the way to the base, and I see that the rail tops are equal, coming over to the other joint, pressing that down. So I have sufficient web reduction on both of them. That's good. Now let's start to look at some of the gauges. As I look at the gauge here, boy, it's just a few thousandths skinny here, and it is perfect through there. I need to take a little more material off of the rail head for this common rail diverging route point rail. Just a little bit more material there. I went ahead and adjusted the notch in the common rail diverging route point rail and the narrow gauge diverging route stock rail. I also cut the base and web off of the standard gauge through route point rail, and then I've done a test fit to make sure that the elevation of the rail head is the same for both rails. I've then gone through using my dial caliper and my NMRA HO standard gauge, and I've checked all of the gauges for both the through route and diverging route for both the narrow gauge and the standard gauge. So I'm now satisfied that this turnout and the frog positions are as good as I'm going to get them. The next step is going to be soldering the frogs. Okay, with all of the rails in position, the gauge checked, it's time to solder the frogs. I'm going to use my Weller 25 watt soldering iron, and I've filed it to a chisel point. I need to tin this before I use it, so I'm going to take a little bit of solder and melt it on the tip of the soldering iron. And get it thoroughly tinned. So now it's got a good coat of solder on it. One more little try here. Yep, flowing nicely. To clean that off, just give it a tap. I like to just tap it onto paper. I don't have a sponge that I wipe the tip off with. Alright, with the soldering iron tip prepared, next thing I want to do is I want to put flux in the areas that we're going to solder. So I just have a micro brush, and I've got some water-soluble flux paste. I'm going to put a little bit right here where we're going to apply the solder on this first frog. Nice thing about these micro brushes is you can get right down in the web of the rail. Get the solder, get the flux down there. When the flux gets heated, it cleans the rail where the solder is going to go. All right. Again, just a touch of solder on my iron. What I really want to do now is I want to heat the rail. So I'm going to put my chisel point on the rail. I'm going to give it a little bit to warm up. I can see that the resin or the flux paste has started to melt. I would prefer that the solder melt by touching the rail, not the soldering iron. So it's almost warm enough to do that for me. There we go. Putting solder down in that space between the two rails. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to work on this one. I'm going to build this material up gradually. Let it heat up. Put the rail down in the space between the rails. It melts readily. Fill that space up. Keep the heat on a little bit to let it flow. And stop. Now I'm going to come back over to this other rail. I'm going to warm it up. I can see the solder is flowing down in the web. It's ready for me to start again. Again, I'm going to give this a little time. There is a space under here that you can see where there's no solder. I'd like to fill that up. I'm going to put the soldering tip on the rail head for the narrow gauge rail. Press it hard so that it touches the web of the narrow gauge diverging route. And see if I can get it to melt in there. Yep. A little bit of melt, a little bit of fill. The narrow gauge needs to be held down a little bit while it solidifies. I'll do that. Give it a moment to set up. Good. I'd like to get a little more solder here in this point. Hold the soldering iron on the rails until I see the previously laid solder liquefy. And I'll go ahead and add a little work. I'm satisfied there. There's going to be a flange path right here, so I don't need to fill that entirely with solder. I'm going to come back here a little farther, warm these rails up. A little more fill here on this one. Good. I'm now going to come over to the next one and solder it. Well, there we have it. The frogs are now grossly soldered in place. They're not complete because we still need to file out the flangeways and we need to put on the wing rails. But let's do that in the next video. Thanks for watching.